Hey everybody. Okay, in this video, we're going to learn about succession, ecological succession. Now, the word succession is used outside of biology. For example, when a king or queen dies, there's the royal succession. After the king or queen dies, a new ruler takes the throne. That's called succession. And it's similar in biology. Ecological succession is where one community replaces another over time. So, for example, you could have a farm, crops, and the farmer passes away or moves away, and the farm is left. It's just left to sit. Now, you're not going to have continued crops of wheat growing. Eventually, seeds will blow in from somewhere for other things. For example, a weed, horseweed. And then you might start to get wildflowers growing. And eventually, it's not going to look like a farm. It might look like a bunch of shrubs, right? That is one community replacing another. That's ecological succession. Now, it isn't always just where a farm is abandoned. Sometimes there are places where there's really very little life growing. If you've ever gone hiking at the top of a cliff, you might have encountered areas where it's just rock. There's nothing living on the rock except maybe a couple of little things. Those first things that can live in that area are called pioneers, just like the first people to move west were pioneers. So the first things to move into an area are called pioneers, and they're frequently something called lichen. Now, the reason that lichen is usually one of the first things to move into an area as a pioneer is because they don't need dirt. So if you're living on a rock and you're grass, you won't survive because there's not enough dirt to hold the water. And your seeds would just blow away. There's nothing for the seeds to sit in. There's no water to be gotten. It's dry. It's no place to live for grass. So grass doesn't grow there. But lichen can. And the reason that lichen can is because it doesn't need soil. And the reason it doesn't need soil, this stuff, is because it's actually two organisms living together. There's a fungus and an algae living together. So if you looked in a microscope at this, you would see this. You have this algae that does photosynthesis and can produce food. But of course, the algae needs water. This fungus around it holds water really well. And so the fungus holds the water and gives it to the algae. The algae makes food and gives it to the fungus. And so they live together as something called lichen. There are many different kinds. These are two examples. They're frequently the first to move in because they don't need dirt. But if they're at the top of a cliff and there's a lot of wind, when they die, they just blow away. But let's say something happens there and there's a big change, an earthquake, and that area is no longer subject to wind. Now its seeds, its body rather, won't blow away, and it can rot right there. And it turns out when you rot things, you actually make dirt. The most important part of dirt is called humus, not to be confused with hummus, the stuff you buy at the grocery store. Humus is really rich dirt. It's really rotted, dead plants and animals. And it, if it doesn't blow away, will sit on this rock, and now grasses can move in. And we have the beginning of a real succession because grasses move in. And then when they rot and die, they can create more humus, and you get shrubs able to grow if there's enough dirt for their roots. And once the shrubs die and rot and you get even more dirt, you start to get the conifers, the evergreens that produce cones, and ultimately you will get deciduous trees, the ones that lose their leaves in the winter. And that's an ecological succession. Whatever community is there at the end, that's called the climax community. So you start with lichens and mosses. You start with your pioneer, and you end with a climax. Now, not everywhere is going to have the same climax community. If you're talking about the top of a cliff where there's wind blowing, the climax community is the pioneers. They're the lichens. But if you're talking about a place where the wind isn't blowing, you might get further along, and you might eventually get to deciduous forest. Depends where you are and what the conditions are. So to recap, succession will start with your pioneers, your lichens and mosses, and then you will get grasses, herbs, shrubs, tree seedlings growing there. Ultimately, you can get various trees moving in until you get to the climax community. Now, I want to be clear, you should not confuse succession with evolution, and this is a very common mistake. And I want you to think about an apartment. Imagine that you have an apartment. There's two options here. You could have the tenant that lives there move out and new tenants move in. And then they live there for a few years and then they move out and new tenants come in. That's succession. Evolution would be if the tenants stayed there and had babies. And their babies, of course, aren't quite like them. And then those babies stayed there and had babies and they weren't quite like them. And you got changes from generation to generation within the same family, always living in that same apartment. That's evolution. So succession, one whole family moves out and somebody else moves in. This is not evolution. This is not the same population having babies with slightly different traits over many, many millions of years. And so that is succession.